call meeting to order, and our business today is a discussion of 160D. And I need to turn it over to you or just to attorney?
You can turn it over to Anna, it'll be just fine.
All right, thank you. Take it away, Anna.
Good morning. So in 2019, the General Assembly passed a law recodifying all of the existing local government planning regulations. Previously, city and county authority for land use planning were in two different statutes, two different chapters. They consolidated all of that so that they're the same. And included in that was a mandate that all local governments update their land use planning ordinances to comply with the new statute. And so we have done that. We have to do it by July 1st, needs to be passed by July 1st. So a couple of the things that 160D changed, conditional use permits are no longer permitted. They have to be special use permits. Black Mountain previously had both conditional uses and special uses. Our conditional uses were specific types of use like tattoo parlors, junkyards. Special use permits were used for different types of subdivisions. So the conservation subdivision, a PUD, those were regulated as special uses. So one of the things that you'll see in the ordinance is that the chapter on conditional uses, chapter 6, has gone away. We've deleted that chapter, and those have been consolidated into one chapter and regulated as special uses.
But they kind of are still the same thing?
Still regulating the same things. You will see, though, that as we went through those, we updated some of the regulations of those specific uses. For instance, in group homes, there were several regulations that actually are just part of the definition or are regulated by state statute. So we didn't need to add those as additional requirements. So you'll see that there are some changes where we've deleted things that were repetitive or not necessary, but none of the actual regulation of those uses has changed. We're also required by the statute to align some of our definitions with state law. So the statute says you cannot have a definition that conflicts with a definition anywhere in state law or regulation, which is a pretty broad mandate since they define things differently in different places. I think really the intent was if the state building code defines building, dwelling, sleeping room in a particular way, we can't define it differently. And so we have tinkered, Jessica and I went back and forth a little bit on some of those definitions to make sure that we are using a definition that makes sense and complies with the new requirements for state law. We've also added definitions for things like administrative hearings, development approvals, legislative hearings. We will no longer talk about quasi-judicial hearings. You make a quasi-judicial hearing in make a quasi-judicial decision in an evidentiary hearing. And so we've added some definitions for those things too. For some reason, we needed to change the word guideline to standards when talking about the historic district, which that has been done as well. So you'll notice in a couple of places throughout the presentation, there are yellow slides. Those are things that are not mandated, but we've recommended that you do anyway. So a couple of years ago, there was a court decision in North Carolina that changed the way that we approach permitted uses. So previously, if your use, your proposed use, was not listed in the permitted uses table, it was prohibited. So anything that the town wanted to allow, it included in a permitted uses table. If it wasn't included there, it's prohibited. The court said, actually, we favor the free use of land, and so you can't just assume that anything not listed is prohibited. If a use that someone brings to the town is not listed, town staff would be charged with finding the next most similar use and regulating the proposed use in the same way as the next most similar use. So if I came to the town and said, I want to open a video game arcade, and that wasn't listed specifically anywhere in the ordinance, Jessica would take a look and see what we regulate that's the next most similar, like indoor recreation might be a broad category that would fall under.
Or you could just add one.
No, I mean, ultimately you could, but that permit applicant would not have to wait for the town to
I
go
see.
through that
I
process.
see.
You would either allow it outright or as a special use or prohibit it based on what is listed in the table. So the way that you would prohibit things is to define them in your list or of definitions, or include them as a listed use on the table, and then not have them listed as permitted in any district. So rock quarries, if we wanted to say rock quarries or racetracks are never allowed in town, you would add that use to your permitted uses table, but then in the list of columns, not have it listed anywhere as permitted. So that is the way that you would specifically prohibit a use. So you'll see some changes in chapter 1 where we've added definitions from the permitted uses table, because one of the things is to make sure that we know what each of those categories of use are defined as, so that we can categorize things to match. So you'll see some new definitions that are added that didn't exist before. Those are uses that were in the table previously, but not defined. The legislation is very clear about defining 3 types of local government decision making. So you have administrative decisions that are generally an applicant is entitled to if they meet all of the requirements of the underlying statute. Those are things that can be decided without any discretion needing to be applied at all. So we're not asking, is this a good idea? We're saying, if the statute says you can have this use in this district, then administratively, we can give you a zoning permit. There are also legislative decisions. That's what this group does. And the planning board, for the most part, makes legislative recommendations. So those are things like text amendments, designation of historic landmarks, or major subdivision approvals, where the applicant isn't necessarily entitled by right to have that approval. But if you all believe in your lawmaking function, that it's a good idea for the town, then you would approve or deny it. And then there are quasi-judicial hearings. Those are things like variances, special use permits, where an evidentiary hearing would be held, certain questions are asked, and if in that evidentiary hearing the board finds that all of the required elements are met, then you would have an approval.
That's still the Board of Adjustment?
Yes.
We don't change the name of it or anything?
Nope. I think we have changed it throughout from zoning board of adjustment to board of adjustment, because they do make some decisions that aren't specifically zoning related.
Could you go back to that other slide?
Certainly.
What is a certificate of appropriateness?
That has to do with the historic district. So if a building downtown wants to make a change to their building facade or their signs, they come to the Historic Preservation Commission and apply for a certificate of appropriateness.
Thank you.
Minor projects, I think there are minor works and major works. Minor works can be approved by staff without needing to come to any board. Major works go through a quasi-judicial process.
What's the definition between the two? What's the difference?
It's pretty specific in the ordinance about what constitutes a minor work, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Very small changes, things that aren't going to affect the visual or structural or architectural integrity of the building. Those are really intended to preserve the existing either structure itself, if it's a historic landmark, or the historic district, so to make sure that it continues to look like the historic downtown. We also, as I went through the section in the statute in the ordinance in chapter 1, where we regulate non-conforming lots, uses, and structures, was kind of jumbled. So we had things where we might be regulating non-conforming structures, but then in that section of the ordinance, we talked about how you use the property. Well, if we're talking about how you use it, that's a non-conforming use, not a non-conforming structure. So that language has been updated. Generally, in all 3 cases, you can continue to use or build onto a structure. Well, build onto. You can make changes or addition to a structure or develop a lot that is non-conforming if you're not enlarging the non-conformity. So if you have a building on a non-conforming lot that, say, encroaches into the setback, you could renovate your kitchen and that would be fine. But if you add on to the building in a way that further encroaches into the setback, that would not be allowed because you're enlarging the non-conformity. Any questions about that? The statute mandates broader conflict of interest language. And so this applies to boards and to staff. If the outcome would have a direct, substantial, and readily identifiable financial impact on the decision maker, you would be prohibited from voting or considering it. If the decision maker has a close familial, business, or other associational relationship with the applicant, then you would be prohibited from voting on or considering it. Familial relationships include parents and siblings, children, spouse, and also relations of the step, half, and in-law. And then other associational relationship, while we don't have a clear definition for that in the statute, probably include things like you sit on the board at your church together. You have played golf every Saturday for the last 20 years. You know, people who you are have a close associational relationship with. There's a little bit of discretion there.
That's everybody in town. I mean,
It is hard.
it's gonna be tough to.
It is hard.
Not as long as they're winning.
Really, the goal is to think about. I'm sorry.
Forgive me, that doesn't apply to the elected officials. It's a different conflict standard.
It will if you're making a legislative decision about an applicant, and that applicant is your mother-in-law, then you would be prohibited from voting.
So that changes that, all that other stuff where you kind of had to be a financial interest.
That's right.
Mhm.
That's right. It
That's
does.
interesting. I thought this didn't apply to elected officials.
I believe that it does. I take a second look. I'll make sure. I believe that and I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but I believe that the definition for both includes that. I'll take a look. We've also rewritten the section on permit choice, and this is related to vested rights. Permit choice initially only applied to, I think, stormwater regulations. Now it's been broadened to apply to every local government rule. And so if I, the applicant, come and apply for my subdivision approval, and while my application is pending, the town changes the subdivision regulations, then I, as the applicant, can choose whether to proceed under the old rule or under the new rule. If the new rule is more beneficial to me, I might choose to do that. If my project requires multiple permits, and I get that first approval, I get to make that choice for any permit that has to be pulled for 18 months. So building permits, subdivision approval, zoning permits, things like that.
So that's just the ones that are that were in process, applications that hadn't been made, but were in process on June the 30th.
Or whenever. I don't know that it's necessarily June 30th. Are you talking about
If the
because
application's made, it's
Because of
that-
July.
yeah,
this taking
Yeah.
effect in July?
right.
Yes.
Well, that could affect anything though, so if the board decides they wanna change subdivision regulations in, let's say 3 months from now, if someone's already in the hopper, they get their choice.
I
Yes.
see. Yes, yeah.
And anyone who has a subdivision approval granted, once the subdivision has been approved, if they come back to apply for a building permit and you have changed the rules regulating their building permit application, they would also get to make the choice for up to 18 months after the initial approval.
So you could have a good bit of that,
Yes, I think so.
especially as busy as things are right now in town.
And that will continue on into the future for any changes you make in the future. So yes, I think that will continue to probably crop up.
This would go into effect when we pass it, right now?
Yes.
July 1.
It goes in, well, you're required by state law to have these changes in effect on July 1.
But if we pass it in the June meeting, it goes into effect. that
July
day.
1. Oh.
Or you
It
could
has an
say-
effective date of July 1.
Oh, okay, got it.
And I think even if you didn't pass it, it's law, and you have to allow it, right?
There's some interesting discussion about that in the land use planning community, about whether your entire zoning ordinance just becomes ultra vires and you don't have one.
You have to kind of think that that's what the legislative people wanted. I mean, they want to control it, so they don't want to let it.
They don't want to let it lapse.
They don't wanna let it lapse. I wouldn't think so.
Permit choice is tied to submission of a complete application. So we have added a requirement for town staff to respond when an application is submitted to let the applicant know whether that submission is complete or not. And then we also consolidated the technical review step that is required for lots of different types of applications in town, where we ask the applicant to come just meet with some of the planning folks, Public Works, the DOT if necessary, to look at a sketch plan or a site plan before they submit the formal application, to make sure that we've addressed everything that we think they need to. For zoning map and text amendments, we have clarified the notice and meeting requirements. The planning board is required to act on a recommendation to make a recommendation within 30 days. If they don't make that recommendation within 30 days, the application can come on to you all for consideration without their recommendation. They meet monthly, so it's not usually an issue. Notice is provided 10 days before, but not more than 25. Posted on the site, published in the paper, and by mail, unless there are more than 50 affected property owners. Certificates of appropriateness, those are those historic district changes to buildings, were previously in Chapter 4 as a zoning regulation for that overlay district. Really makes more sense for them to be in Chapter 1, so we've moved that whole thing. So you'll see a whole section added on certificates of appropriateness in Chapter 1. That's not new language, it's just been moved from one place to the other. The section on vested rights has also been updated and clarified. So unless you have substantially commenced the work on your project, and that includes things like pulling a building permit, putting in a foundation, installing infrastructure. If you haven't done any of those things, then your permits expire within 6 months for a building permit, 2 to 5 years for site-specific plans. 7 years for multi-phase developments, or in development agreements, you can specify the date for when those permits expire. And for any other type of approval, 1 year. So any other approval would be things like a zoning permit, a certificate of appropriateness. I'm trying to think what else we have that's a development approval. Site-specific vesting plans are specifically defined. They include anything that you would think of as having to submit a site plan to the town. So that is in your discretion, what you want to consider a site-specific vesting plan. Those site-specific plans have a longer period of time where they can sit without work being done. So you can allow up 2 to 5 years for those. Right now, those include special use permits, major and minor subdivisions. You could also add things like certificates of appropriateness, or other site-specific approvals. In some jurisdictions, any type of zoning application is a site-specific plan.
Of course, this is statewide, it's county, it's all municipalities, it's the whole sheet match.
That's right.
Because that's what could apply to the Avon building permit. It could have a longer period.
Good.
If that's what but the county has to specify that. You have to say how long it could be for something specific.
Yes and no, because these are statutory vested rights. And so the state government is saying to the local government. Once you have given permission for this project to begin, you can't withdraw that ability for a set period of time. That question would turn on whether their project was site specific. And if the local government's or Buncombe County's ordinance defines site specific plans to include that, then they would have that 2 to 5 years. If not, then they might have a shorter window.
I think they had 2 to 5, they had to have 2 to 5 on the one that they had.
It's been a while.
Yeah, I mean, it was more than, I bet it was 5.
It's probably been 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Right at it.
I feel like it's been longer, but whatever.
We've also updated, clarified, and just reorganized the enforcement issues. There was language kind of sprinkled throughout various chapters in the ordinance about what happened if you weren't complying. And so really trying to have all of that in one section that staff can refer to, one set of processes to go through for a warning, a notice of violation, a stop work order, and the appeals. Those have all been collected into one place.
And as you know, the town went through some gyrations with one of our business sites down on 70.
Mm-hmm.
How would the new rules under 160D have maybe changed the way that was processed? I think the roof was started a little bit. I mean, you can hardly get kind of nail a board here and there kind of thing. They just drug on forever. Would this change any of that all that much?
It just simplifies it quite a bit. And so there were kind of a spider web of requirements to go through when you were trying to enforce existing building code or zoning ordinances. Now that those have been collected in the statute all in one place, so it's all the same procedure. And in our ordinance, they've been collected in one place and clarified. And so just makes the process easier to understand, easier for town staff to actually enforce. And because of that, probably shortens the window of time that you have to go through. They don't necessarily have to come to this board for authorizations for as many steps in the process as they did before. State law now requires that notices of violation or stop work orders can be delivered by email. It's an update. We've also clarified some of the appeal procedures to match the statute. So some appeals that come here, some that go to the insurance commission, some that go to the Board of Adjustment. A couple of minor changes to the building code. We don't need to duplicate anything in our ordinance that is already spelled out in the building code that is adopted by the Building Code Council. And so where processes are already included for permit applications, things like that, we don't have to duplicate that language. We only need to clarify where we are different than the building code. And so we made some of those changes. That also includes some clarified language about the condemnation process, which is part of what I was just referencing, where that enforcement piece has been consolidated in statute and in our ordinance. For subdivision approvals, we are required by statute to make sure that DOT and MSD have an opportunity to provide comment. So we've added that. Performance guarantees. So for infrastructure that's going to go in a major subdivision, the bond is 1 year initially, unless the developer wants that bond to be longer. So the town can't require that the bond be 2, 3, 4 years, but the developer can voluntarily do that. If as the expiration date for the bond approaches, if it's clear that the work is not going to be complete, then the guarantee shall be extended. So there's a mandatory, the developer must extend the bond. And there's some language there about how to figure what the cost, what the coverage of the bond amount will be if for that renewal. For subdivision approvals, and you'll see this is one of those yellow slides, it's not mandatory, but something that we recommend. that we match up the notice requirements for the meetings so that you don't have staff trying to figure out what timelines and what types of notice to give for the two different types of applications. And so that just will hopefully save some time and expense on the part of town staff and reduce the possibility of making error. We also clarified the distinction for an exempt subdivision for conservation dedication, and then the separate approval for a conservation subdivision. So when the land use code was rewritten in 2009, 10, there was a specific type of subdivision allowed for called a conservation subdivision. And the whole idea is I own a tract of land that has some environmentally sensitive areas. I want to create a residential subdivision on that piece of property. But if I have to create traditional lots with the same minimum lot sizes and all of the existing road standards that the town has, I'm going to have to destroy some environmentally sensitive lands to be able to do that. And so as an incentive, the town created this conservation subdivision, which gives some flexibility to the developer to vary the lot sizes, change the lot lines, change the layout of roads or infrastructure. Separate from that, if you are just chopping off a couple of acres of your property to make a dedication to Southern Highlands for conservation, that is not regulated as a subdivision at all. It's exempt from the subdivision ordinance. And so just really trying to clarify that so that it's clear that those are two different things. In the zoning regulations chapter itself, chapter 4, there were some provisions there that really are included in chapter 1, things like notice of violation that were deleted. We clarified the purpose and intent statements, things really tedious, like removing the bullet points and making them actually part of the paragraph on purpose and intent for each zone. Previously in the ordinance, every zone had its own permitted uses table and its own dimensional table. We've done away with those individual tables and replaced them with just the one comprehensive table. That the comprehensive table already exists in the ordinance itself. It just makes the ordinance much easier to read as you're going through if it's not broken up by all those individual tables. And then we clarified the language, the uses not listed. That's what I was mentioning earlier. If you don't have a use listed in a permitted uses table, that you have to allow it in the same way that you would allow a similar use. And then we revised the language for temporary uses. There were several types of temporary uses listed in chapter 4 that really fall under your special events permit. There are not many things in town that need to be regulated as a temporary use. I think the things that are there include commercial lot sales, so things like a Christmas tree lot in December that might go up for a limited amount of time. It's a temporary use. It's not a special event that's going to pop up for 2 days and go away. Church revival, tent revival kind of things where those might exist for a month or two. Chapter 6 and 7 have been consolidated. So we did away with all those conditional use permits, and special use permits now rule the day. Those previously were the two separate, as I mentioned earlier, one for uses, one for subdivisions. Those are all quasi-judicial. They go to the Board of Adjustment. There's a set of questions that the Board of Adjustment asks about to measure whether these permits should be granted. You can attach conditions to them. We updated those notice requirements again to match the subdivision and zoning amendment notifications so that those are the same. And the standards for specific uses like junkyards, tattoo parlors, group homes, daycares have been updated for clarity and to remove kind of extraneous language. Chapter 12 has gone away. There is no longer any statutory authority for the inclusionary housing bonus. So our ordinance previously had a density bonus that would allow you to increase the density in a development if you dedicated a certain amount of land to a certain amount of the development to affordable housing. Chapter 160D has specific authority for those type of density bonuses for green building. You can do it for green building, environmental incentive. There are other types of authorities, things that the town can do for affordable housing. You can run a program that buys up and sells property for affordable for workforce inclusionary housing. You can offer some different types of incentives, but density bonus is not one of them. So that chapter was deleted. A couple of recommendations just after going through the ordinance for 2.5 months in detail. The Black Mountains ordinance was rewritten in 2009, but the basis of that ordinance really was the existing ordinance that had existed since the late 90s at least, which means there's not really been a comprehensive start from scratch, think about how we regulate land uses for more than 20 years. And I think it is costing developers and it is costing the town in additional time spent by staff. I think there's also probably some potential liabilities lurking in there where if our zoning code is hard for us to understand and enforce, and a decision is made that is not correct because it's hard or there are inconsistencies in the language. The new 160D requires, in some instances, mandatory payment of attorney's fees for a developer who's successful in challenging a decision under the code. And so I strongly encourage you to consider a comprehensive rewrite of the land use code using a consultant who does this kind of work for other local governments. That would involve, I think, probably community charrettes. It's a long process to go through where you get feedback from residents in town about what type of regulation they'd like to see, and you get a cleaner code that's easier to understand for the folks who live and work here and for town staff.
So you would think that's did you say 2-year process probably, or one?
At
At
least one.
18 to 24 months.
Yeah.
With an outside team working on it.
So what would you, not holding any numbers, but what would something like that
I'd say
cost?
probably 100,000,
$80,000 to $100,000.
Mhm,
pretty close.
mhm. So when would be probably any time's a good time to do that, but is it an opportune time to do it just because of the major changes?
I think so. I mean, I think as folks in town are and town staff are trying to adjust just to these changes and understand it. My hope is that the rewritten code is a little easier to read now than it was before. But there really hasn't been anyone sit down and look at the permitted uses table, for instance, and say, the things that we need to regulate have changed dramatically in the last 10 years. There are uses that exist now that didn't exist in 2009. And so the opportunity to do that, I think, is good.
Probably, I would think, the council needs to think about it. We have a lot on our plate right now,
It's true.
and we just finished, the
Comprehensive plan.
comprehensive plan. And I just wonder about public fatigue with it, just a
Sure.
bit,
If I can just make one comment to that too, that, these ordinances are how you put your comprehensive plan on the ground. So I do think that there's that timing of something being opportune, we have all these changes at the state. But, your regulations have to manifest something, and that's how your comprehensive plan, ends up being implemented, is through your regulations and policies. So aligning them, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think it's important too. I think it's just a matter of timing a bit. So something to think about.
We're also recommending that the town adopt conditional zoning jurisdiction-wide. That Black Mountain currently has 2 conditional zones. So conditional zone means I, the developer, come to the town with an overall plan for a site. That plan would not be allowed under existing zoning ordinances, but the town can review my master plan, rezone my specific lot, and apply a zoning ordinance specifically for my piece of property. And so the T&D, the Cheshire development, is functionally a conditional zone, even though that's not what we called it at the time. That language didn't really exist in 97 when that was enacted. The ICD district for In the Oaks is also functionally a conditional zone. The developer came to the town with a master plan and said, I would like you to give me special approval to do this thing that isn't otherwise allowed in town. Over the last 20 years, that's become much more common in jurisdictions all around North Carolina. So this would not involve rezoning all of town, but an applicant could come apply for a rezoning for a conditional zone. There are several different versions of conditional zoning that exist. The one that I think the planning board has reviewed and made a recommendation about this week would mean that there's a conditional zone associated with each of the existing base zones. So you could apply for a conditional zoning designation for UR8, and your conditional zone would be UR8 conditional zone, some signifier for the site. That allows the town to do similar to what you would do in a conditional or a special use permit, where you look at that specific site and you say, okay, this makes sense. We would like for you to be able to have the greater density that you're applying for, or have a reduced setback on all of your lots. But we only want to do that if you install shrubbery along the street front, or you ensure that the roads are an additional 5 feet wide in this particular development. And so it's an opportunity really for the developer and the town to engage in a little bit of discussion about what would make this particular project beneficial to the town and in line with the comprehensive plan. As part of that, we would recommend replacing the T&D zoning designation as instead probably neighborhood mixed use conditional zone. And the ICD district would be replaced with an office institutional conditional zone. For the ICD district, that's pretty straightforward. They have a master plan that looks like a plat with building locations on it. Nothing for them is going to change in their application or approval process for their uses. I've been in touch with the folks over at the college, and we're making sure that they're comfortable with those. I've also had a couple of meetings with Mr. Reagan, who is the developer for Cheshire. I think Cheshire is particularly challenging because that approval was done so long ago. And so we're really working to make sure that we have a good understanding with him of what his existing plans are, how those align with what was approved, making sure that the application process going forward for him, that we are clear on the town staff side and from the development side, what things are permitted without having to come for additional approvals through the board. So that's a lot. You'll be hearing about conditional zoning again. That's going to be coming to you. So there'll be more opportunities for us to talk about it.
So remind me what the planning board is approved and sending our way.
So the planning board at this last meeting approved conditional zoning.
They recommended conditional zoning in that most conservative nature with the duplicate conditional district as opposed to some of the more wider nets that conditional zoning can be applied to.
That would be a July public hearing.
And that is not, they have not recommended rezoning anything. It just adds the language to the zoning ordinance to
I see.
permit
Yeah,
conditional.
sort of what, I had a few conversations with Josh, just trying to get a handle on things from, 10,000 feet, a little bit more. And I think that's actually very important for any public listening in to understand that our zoning map, it looks the same. it's really the application process as much as anything. And 160D does, I mean, what you've gone through sometimes, it seems like your first reaction is that there's a lot of change and it's complicated for people, but the real objective, based on my conversations with Josh and what, a little bit I've read about it and so forth, is that it makes it a little simpler for the applicant. And because it's simpler for the applicant, it makes it a little bit easier for the town to process as well, I think. So
That's right.
I think once we get through the hurdle of it, but I think it is important for the public to understand that there's no changes, whatever your property's owned, nothing changes with 160D.
That's right. That's right.
But, and I think, with conditional zoning, you set that expectation for folks and they know what's coming.
Right.
So I think it's easier for folks to understand, well, this is exactly what we're doing here. We're not doing the potential of 20 different things.
Right.
It's this thing, that's what we're doing.
So this is what, either anybody, the three of you can just respond to this, but to me, this is a basic question that the public would ask. I live in a neighborhood, we're zoned, whatever. So if somebody buys the vacant lot, can they just come and get conditional zoning and do what they want to with it?
It actually is, it's a tool in your belt that allows you to have a little bit more say-so in what they can do. So if they are in if they're in the highway business district, the zoning ordinance has a whole lot of things that you can do in the highway business district without much need for a whole lot of oversight, right? If your plan meets the list of uses and the dimensional requirements and you install the infrastructure, you can do it. With a conditional zoning application, though, the applicant needs to come to the town and say, here is exactly my plan. And if the town doesn't like that, they can deny the application. And that's a legislative decision that this board would make. And so you get the discretion to really look at it and say, what would make this particular project beneficial to the town and in line with our comprehensive plan? Down the line, you might decide that there are some things that you want to allow in conditional districts that are not allowed outright in the base districts. So, you might have commercial uses over 5,000 square feet, where that's a big impact in a particular district in town. And if you're going to build a building that's that large, the town would like to have a little more oversight over what you do. Right now, we're not making any of those changes to how uses are regulated. We are only adopting the language about how you would apply for a conditional zoning application. But I think as you move forward and in thinking about a comprehensive rewrite of the land use code, there are some ways that you can use conditional zoning that allow you to have a really good understanding with a developer about what's going to go in and the conditions that need to be applied.
Right. And that seems like a healthy way to proceed, really.
Yeah, and kind of taking it in steps, right? So we're
Right.
not ripping off the whole Band-Aid
Right.
all at once.
Right.
And it may be that there are no additional changes that come at all to conditional zoning. This may really only be for things like density and setback, lot dimensions.
So what are the next steps for us to move forward with conditional zoning?
I think you'll have a call for public hearing for July.
Have a call at this next meeting, you'll call for public hearing, you'll have a hearing in July.
One last recommendation, there are some zoning overlay districts that I think ultimately can be done away with as zoning districts. So that'll be another change that comes to you in the future. It's not part of these changes. The wellhead protection overlay, Black Mountain actually was the first jurisdiction in the state to do this type of wellhead protection. And it was done as an overlay zoning district. Since then, lots of jurisdictions have done wellhead protection. Congrats on being one of the first, a leader in environmental regulation. But most other jurisdictions now do that just as an environmental regulation, not as a zoning district. And especially because the zoning district is tied to the location of existing and operable wells that we're trying to protect, that means that that zoning overlay really needs to change as well as go offline. And that's not been kept up with administratively. And so I think it probably makes more sense for that to be an environmental regulation. We also have the primary fire district overlay. That can be done separately. It's not in most jurisdictions a zoning overlay district. We'll have a map of the primary and secondary fire districts, and we've talked with the fire chief about that. And then your pedestrian master plan overlay. Again, I think that can become a sidewalk ordinance that talks about when sidewalks need to be constructed. That can be tied to your pedestrian master plan without needing to have a separate overlay zoning designation. All of those three things really are geared toward making it easier for folks to understand the zoning of their property. The fewer layers that you stack on top of each other, the easier it is for someone to look at the zoning map and figure out what regulations apply to their specific parcel.
It's your last slide.
1 hour, 15 minutes. Sorry to get a little long.
Oh, wait. Question.
41.
Oh, that's right. We started at 8:30. Ooh, under an hour.
Better than you thought.
Great.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah.
Does anybody have questions for Anna that we didn't cover during the presentation?
So we'll be discussing this in the June meeting, and there's a public hearing and voting on it.
Public hearing June meeting. We called for the public hearing last month.
And the deadline for adoption is July 1st. So keep that in mind. The effective date for the ordinance will be July 1st. And if you haven't adopted it by July 1st, we might get to have a lot of fun figuring out what that means. So let's get that done. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. Appreciate it. Pam, did you have a question?
Does this impact, so we had an annexation and rezoning earlier this year.
Mhm.
And if that same situation came up with this new ordinance, have changed how we approach that process? This is a different thing altogether.
I don't think so. I think the zoning, I think the annexation and zoning request would have come through the same process. Yes?
Annexation would, I think the difference in the presentation of the actual project, it could have, the rezoning, the judicial rezoning could have been requested as a conditional rezoning.
Right.
And that site plan that they were sharing could have been negotiated under those conditions and adopted as an individual site-specific ordinance to that location.
Yeah, as I understood it, and I think Rod explained it even when we were in the middle of the discussion.
Yeah.
If you had.
See, we were annexing and saying, well, we're gonna annex first, but don't annex if you're not gonna change it to whatever we changed it to, or zoned it, because it was not zoned, it was in the county. Whereas under 160D, we would have had the plan to approve. We could have negotiated and so forth, and it wouldn't have been
the difference.
it would have been a little easier to process.
That's right. There's specific language in the statute that allows for the zoning approval process to proceed alongside the annexation process so that both of those decisions can be made at the same
Oh, so you can
time.
make provision for it. Were you gonna say something,
I
Jessica?
was just gonna add that, applicants request conditional rezoning. And so the ability to, if you are wanting to develop something and you are 8, and you're not comfortable, the planning board's not comfortable with it presenting or unclear if they're really married to that idea, you can reject that traditional request and make a comment that you would rather see a conditional application. They can
Right.
choose to do that or not.
Right,
There are still instances where you will see a traditional rezoning. If I have a parcel and I just wanted to be, rezone it and do it up for my grandchildren, I don't have a plan.
right.
I just need a slightly more density so I can have even number of lots. Those things will crop up occasionally, but by and large, bigger projects will come through that conditional process, either because they see that that's the way to go and that's what they're used to, or because they deny it at a traditional request level.
So I wouldn't know how much more of this we'll see, although it's addressed in the comprehensive plan, the new comprehensive plan, but the voluntary annexation. But if I understand the mechanics of it, 160D provisions together with voluntary annexation make that a better process than it is now. It seems to me.
A lot less anxiety for the community.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it gives the town much better tools to bring a development in. it's not a guessing game back and forth, you're just, am I being too plain in language, just by saying, really, you negotiate, you say, this is what we want. If we're gonna bring you into the town, this is what we, it's what conditional zoning would be, and you got a good bit more leverage with it than, leverage now is water.
I think you get the opportunity to have those discussions about how you make sure that a proposed development is consistent with the vision for Black Mountain from the comprehensive plan, and the ability to ask for the developer to make certain concessions or attach conditions. When you anytime that you're attaching conditions that way under this ordinance, under the statute, the developer needs to agree to them. They're very restricted in the types of conditions that you can apply without the agreement of the developer.
Right.
But it really is set up to allow that to be a conversation. We want your development to be successful, right? That's in the interest of the town for the development to be successful and marketable and well built. But we also want to make sure that we are measuring and responding to the impacts on the community so that it's good for the community as well. And the statute really envisions that process being joint that way.
Great, thank you. Any questions, comments for Anna? Thank you, Anna, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Before we adjourn, any board members?
I've got, after y'all, I've got a couple things.
I don't think anybody had any.
Okay. So just a reminder, we are closed Monday for Memorial Day. Wish everybody a happy holiday. And our next meeting will be Thursday next week, and it will be budget. So my plan is to kind of go through like we did the first time in March. Now it's much more refined. And before we do all this printing of all this stuff, I want to go through it first to make sure we need to make changes before we print all this information out. So that's my plan for Thursday next week. And then lastly, Councilmember Raines will be resigning from the board as of June 14th will be his last meeting. And I just spoke with him the past couple of days, and yesterday he told me he wanted me to announce it today. So there you go.
Yes, it's been my honor and privilege to serve the town for almost 3 years. My wife Renee and I are entering a new phase of our lives, and we're looking forward to that. But Black Mountain will always be home, and we'll be back. And it's been a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We appreciate your service and appreciate you very much. The only thing I want to add is, and this will just be a continuation, I think, of our budget discussion next week, because I think it's a budget issue at this point in time, is our infrastructure needs with our new monies. And the first 1/2 or so of the new monies will be coming in soon. We have two essential infrastructure projects. One is a stormwater related project, and it is in the tune of around $500,000, and it's to repair the dam at Lake Tomahawk, which we have to do. DEQ is saying we have to do that. And the second is a similar cost project, and it is to extend for about 3,500 feet the line from the new pump station to a site. It's at Blue Ridge Road, but it's 3,500 feet or so. The pipe is, it's going to make it sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I don't. A 6-inch pipe is currently a 6-inch pipe going into a 10. And we need a 10-inch pipe. It's not working. And I think, you can look back and say, well, why wasn't it called earlier? I think they had to see if it would work, frankly, because you don't want to spend $500,000 if you don't need to. But it looks like we're going to have to. So we have those two projects, and I want the board to be aware of that. You may have already been aware of it, but it is, I'm recommending to Josh to incorporate that. And I would think you also would incorporate the matching revenue that we'll receive from the grants. It's really grants, I believe that the term would be, to those expenditures. And that might go over 2 fiscal years, but it may not. Because explain to us the dam work.
So
If you want to expand on either or both projects.
So what let me say this first. So the money that we're gonna receive from the American Rescue Plan will go into its own fund, right? Which will carry over multiple years.
Because it has to be accounted for.
That's correct. Then we'll keep it separate in that fund. That way it's easy to count debits and credits and we'll know
Right.
what's going on. The dam work, more than likely, well, it just depends on what comes back. At this point, they've told me probably around $500,000, but they're not gonna know until they do some design and get the state's approval. It looks like we're gonna have to reinforce the whole grass bank now is gonna have to be reinforced with block. That's all gonna be block, more than likely. The spillway may have to be redone because it is undersized. That dam was constructed in the 30s, and since it started leaking, we had that seepage, which is normal for earthen dams. That's when the state got involved, and when that happens, you've got to bring things up to current standards. As you can imagine, the standards today are much more stringent than they were in the 30s. So that's where we are with the dam. But depending on what that looks like, it may span more than 1 year, just depending on how much stuff we've got to do out there.
Right, thank you. Any other comment on the water line?
The water line, I think that's something we really weren't, like the mayor mentioned, we weren't sure what we needed. But after we've got in there now, we've been pumping water, at least since, last year. It's not being able to get enough water to the system. So we're running the pumps much longer because the pipe's constricted.
So that's all I know, is special call meeting, but those are just announcements to make, and we'll look forward to meeting next Thursday. Pam?
There's no funding associated with that dam repair?
We are working on trying to find funds now. And I think historically, at least the past 2 federal fiscal years, there has been some allocation through FEMA for dam work that has not been allocated yet. Maybe in October when they do pass the new budget, it will be. And if it is, we are ready to go after that money. So we have been doing our research on that, and we're kind of in line right now waiting.
So would it be a mistake to go ahead and fund it with American Rescue Plan money, and then FEMA gets the impression we don't need it?
Well, that's probably something worth talking about.
There's a timing question here.
And we may not even.
It goes both ways, because,
Yeah.
because it's an expenditure that comes, and also just the details, in which I'm not certain of, in the final interim report, as to a project and your commitment to it and it qualifying for the grants. So we got some work to do to make sure we know what we can do. That could kind of cut both ways, really, I think.
And it may not even be, we may not even be going to construction by October on the dam. I'm not sure. I mean, that may be something we can wait on. I mean, I just don't know yet.
Yeah.
I mean, it took the state quite a few months to get back to us on this phase of it. So it may take quite a few months.
Before we commit to anything, we just need to make sure that we're not hemmed in, because it's one thing to put it in our thinking.
I agree.
It's another thing to accept those monies and to start a project, and, and as you know, the rules are pretty detailed.
Right.
And so, it's what I wanted to make sure to the public and the board is that we do have these 2 projects that are just essential. We pretty much have to do them. And so, they do fit within the stormwater and the water infrastructure components of what we can spend the money on. And we just need to take that into consideration, because those funds should be flowing, from the state to us before too long.
They don't have to be obligated until 2024. So it's not like we have to spend them tomorrow.
Well, but the dam needs to be replaced.
Yeah, for sure,
Water
for
plant
sure.
needs to be
Yeah.
replaced, so that's the issues.
Yeah,
Yeah, if we could just wait forever, that would be great, but we can't.
yeah, I know. I hear
Yeah,
you.
they have to be obligated by 24 and spent by 26. As long as you've got it obligated, you've got till 2026 to spend it.
Right.
You can't wait till, 2024 to start obligating it. You've got to already have it in
I think we
Hopper.
can obligate it.
I don't think that'll be a problem.
That part's easy.
I don't think that'll be a problem.
That part's easy. Just don't want the, we don't want
We
the.
don't want the dam to fall.
Do everything right. That's right. That's exactly right. Okay, if there are no other comments, thank you, everyone. Meeting adjourned, and we'll see you next Thursday. Happy Memorial Day.